Some of you might know that we're in a message series in the book of John. And so this week we're continuing with that. Last week, John's son took us through the first part of John chapter 2. Now, in the first part of John chapter 2 that John's son covered so well last week, we learned that Jesus was attending a wedding. As this wedding progresses, we find that the people hosting the wedding actually ran out of wine. Now, weddings were an important event in that culture as they are today. Weddings are very important. And there were probably guests there who had traveled from very far away just to attend this wedding. And so running out of wine was a problem because it would have been a very big embarrassment to the family at that time. But because Jesus is also there, because Jesus is also attending the wedding, Jesus' mother tells him about this issue. She says to him, look, we've run out of wine. She also tells the servants to say, do whatever Jesus tells you to do. Jesus then instructs the servants, we're told in the text, to bring 6 jars of water. And Jesus performs this miracle. He turns the water in the jars into wine. Now, one of the things that Jesus shows us in this first sign, in this first miracle that he performs of turning water into wine, is that Jesus isn't, in fact, Lord. He is master over physical nature. Jesus has creative power. In fact, scripture tells us that everything that was created through Jesus, and without him, nothing was made. Jesus' turning water into wine is also a symbol. It's a sign of the effect that Jesus can have on people's lives. Just like he turns this ordinary water into wine, Jesus' presence in your life and in my life, it has this ability to change, to transform that which seems ordinary, that which seems plain, and to give it a new purpose, to transform it and to change it into something significant. Now, I would submit to you that this is provided that we pay attention to the words of Jesus' mother. Remember, Jesus' mother said to the servants, do whatever Jesus tells you to do. And so if you and me want to see a change, if you and me want to witness a transformation in our hearts and in our lives, then we need to be attentive to Jesus' words. You and me, like those servants, need to be willing to do whatever Jesus would instruct us to do. But if we're honest, we'll find that you and me often don't want to do what Jesus tells us to do. Let's be honest and admit that it's a challenge sometimes. Jesus' words to us and his instructions are not always comfortable. But when Jesus comes into our lives, he's in fact offering us a new quality of life. Just like he turns this ordinary water into sparkling, delicious wine, in fact, the people at the wedding, they say, where is this wine coming from? Jesus can have the same effect. He can add color and flavor and freshness and indeed joy to our lives, especially and even when it seems difficult and impossible. And so in that first part of John chapter 2, we see that Jesus has power over physical nature. Now, in the second half that was read to us by Becky's son, we see that Jesus not only has power over physical nature, but Jesus also has authority and power over moral nature. What do I mean by that? Well, Jesus has the authority and the power to instruct us between right and wrong, between good and bad, between darkness and light. Jesus has that authority. And so moving on into the second half of John chapter 2, we're told that Jesus is in the capital city. He's in Jerusalem to attend the Jewish Passover celebration. Passover is a festival where the Israelites, they remember their freedom from slavery when they were in Egypt. And so this was a time when Jews from all over the place, they would travel and gather in Jerusalem, especially to the temple, to the Lord's house in Jerusalem, to worship God there and to offer sacrifices. And so imagine with me that the temple in Jerusalem is not just any ordinary building to the Jewish people. It's the center of their religious life. It's a special building to them. The temple was believed to be the dwelling place of God's people, a very special place. In the temple, people would come to pray. They would come from far and wide to offer sacrifices and to connect with God. However, we see in the passage that was read that what Jesus finds when he goes to the temple is not what someone would expect of this holy and special place. We're told in verse 14 that this is what happens. We're told there in the temple, Jesus found people selling cattle and sheep and doves in the temple. It also says he saw money changers sitting at their tables and doing business. Jesus must have thought to himself, what's going on here? Instead of a place of worship, instead of a place of connecting with God, this place looks like a market. Animals are being sold. Money changers are present, exchanging the money currency of the people who were traveling from far and wide. Now, in my country, money changers have a pretty bad reputation. They're always trying to sell you their currency or to buy your currency and to make a profit. And so instead of an atmosphere of worship, imagine with me, there's noise, there's chaos, there's commotion. The temple looks like a market. Now, all of this might sound, on one level, very practical and convenient because, honestly, people are coming from far and wide. They don't want to struggle to find animals to sacrifice, and they don't want to struggle to exchange their foreign currency. But when we dig deeper, we discover that part of the issue here was how business was being done, how these activities were being conducted. Because in the book of Matthew, Jesus also chases people out of the temple. And in Matthew, Jesus says these words. He says, "My house should be called a place of worship, but you've turned it into a place where robbers hide." Other versions might say, "You've turned it into a den of thieves." And so we learn that what was being done in the temple was being done dishonestly, with no focus on honoring God. And so this had become all about business. This had become all about making money, and in crooked and unjust ways. Scholars of the Bible will tell us that, in fact, the chief priests, the people who were supposed to be in charge of the temple, they were also involved in this type of business. They were benefiting, getting money from these unjust practices that were going on in the temple. And so when Jesus sees all of this, he says in verse 16, "Stop turning my Father's house into a market." Now, certainly there's nothing wrong with doing business and making money and making a profit. But one scholar has made what I think is a very insightful observation about the type of business that is going on in the temple. He connects it with our salvation as Christians and as believers. He points out that the fact that Jesus doesn't want this type of corruption, this type of business this type of commerce going on in his house should be a small reminder to you and me that our salvation, it cannot be bought. It cannot be earned. It is a gift. Our salvation is something given freely to us by God to those who choose to trust him. It's something we cannot buy with our efforts or with money. And so you and me, we serve God not to earn or to buy our salvation, but we serve God because he has saved us and changed our hearts. And so Jesus sees all what's going on in the temple, and it deeply disturbs him. Why? Well, because the temple is supposed to be a house of prayer, not a marketplace, especially for corrupt business. So what does Jesus do? Well, in verse 15, we're told that Jesus makes a whip out of ropes. Imagine that. That's a very scary picture. And Jesus begins to drive out from the temple the sheep. He scatters the coins of the money changers. He overturns the tables. Imagine with me this kind of picture. Jesus says, "This is my Father's house. Stop turning it into a market." And he flips a table and he chases out some sheep and some goats. Now Jesus is letting them know to say, look, I'm not just any ordinary worshiper. This place belongs to my Father, and I have authority to do what I'm doing. Now, this is something that the chief priests, the people in charge, this is something that they don't want to hear. In fact, this is very shocking for them to hear. Because in verse 18, they basically say to Jesus, look, where are you getting the authority to do what you're doing? Show us your authority. We are the ones in charge here, not you. Now, what Jesus is doing is also indicating to us something a lot deeper about what's going on. Jesus' actions are not only telling us that he has authority from God, but he's also telling us that he is going to completely do away with this type of worshiping God. He's going to do away with having to go to the temple continually and to offer sacrifices of doves and sheep and goats and animals. He's indicating to them to say, I am doing away with this kind of worship. Jesus is trying to let them know that he himself would become the final sacrifice for humanity's sin. We see this and we can know this because in verse 19 and verses 20, it says there, all right, Jesus replied, destroy this temple and I will build it up in 3 days. What? They exclaimed. It's taken us 46 years to build this temple, and you are saying you can rebuild it in 3 days? Then verse 21 reveals to us a mystery. It says, but when Jesus said this temple, he was talking about his own body. And after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered what he said, and they believed the scriptures and what Jesus said. Now, I was wondering to say, why would Jesus react so strongly to all of this? Jesus, who was typically gentle, some say mild and self-controlled, even when he was attacked and insulted and spat on by others, Jesus would never react in such a strong way. I believe that the answer lies in the fact that Jesus, who was perfectly God, perfectly man, he had the right passion for the right things. Jesus is also showing us that what you are willing to fight for very often will show us what you are truly passionate about. I'm amazed at the kind of passion that people have for things that I personally don't care about. For them, it's fine, but there are certain things that just don't bother me. There are people, especially in my country, who are passionate about football. They are die-hard fans. They never miss a game. They argue and fight about football. Some are told are baseball fans, others basketball fans. They are passionate about the game. Some people love anime and J-pop. People are passionate about different things. There are people who are incredibly passionate about food. In fact, in the US, there's a popular restaurant called Popeyes. I'm told Popeyes has a fantastic chicken sandwich. I've never tasted it. My favorite chicken sandwich is from Pito Yokado. That's a secret for you right there. But I'm told Popeyes has a delicious chicken sandwich. And it's interesting to me how many fights have been recorded over this popular Popeyes sandwich. In fact, it's reported that one fight started over this chicken sandwich and it got so bad that someone was stabbed and later died in a hospital. Imagine that, dying over a chicken sandwich. My goodness. And so people are passionate. They're willing to fight for different things. But here we're being told that Jesus has a passion, he has a zeal for God's house. In fact, in verse 17, it's clearly stated there. It says, my love, in talking about Jesus, it says, the disciples, they remembered the scriptures that talk about Jesus and say, my love for your house burns in me like a fire. Jesus was passionate about God's house. And so Jesus' reaction in this passage reflects his resistance to anything that will corrupt people and disconnect them from God. He's passionate about bringing down things that interfere with people connecting with God. Now, as I head towards a conclusion, when Jesus enters the temple, he finds it being used for business rather than worship. And I believe that his reaction is not just about the physical space, the physical building, but it has a very deep spiritual significance for you and me. And so this is not just a story about just Jesus cleaning out the temple. But it's a very clear picture of the challenges that you and I face today as well. Just like the temple was filled with distractions and wrong priorities, I believe that our lives, our hearts, can also become occupied with all sorts of things that don't belong there. Remember with me that the temple was a sacred and a special place. It was a place designed for worshiping and connecting with God. And so are our hearts. Our hearts are meant to be places where God's presence, God's thoughts, God's words can dwell richly. But I believe that our hearts and our lives can very quickly become filled with things that interfere with how you and me can worship God and how we can connect with him. Our hearts and our lives quickly become filled with things that will prevent us from making a meaningful connection with our Father. Think with me how easily God is pushed out of our hearts and our minds. God gets replaced by all sorts of things, and these things are not necessarily bad, but God gets pushed out by our jobs, by social media, by entertainment. Your heart and my heart are quickly filled with feelings of anger and lust and unforgiveness and bitterness and pride and envy, and we can go on and on. You and me know the things that fill our hearts and quickly replace God there. And so just like these corrupt traders and businessmen and money changers were in the temple, these things also enter our hearts and they begin to distract our connection with God. They begin to hinder us from worshiping God as we should. Well, I believe that you and I can ask Jesus by his Holy Spirit to help us look into our hearts. I believe that it's our responsibility to sometimes take the time to think about the things which are occupying our hearts and our lives and our schedules. We need to think about some of the things that slowly creep in and begin to become a priority over God in our lives. Are we letting these things come into our lives and distract us from walking with God, distract us from loving God, distract us from making a meaningful connection with our Father? This past week, I was listening to an accomplished author, an entrepreneur, and a businessman. He's done incredibly well for himself. But he said something very insightful. He pointed out how he's often so tempted to become so busy that he forgets about the meaningful things in his life, the important things in his life, his family, his wife. He's so tempted to focus on just other things that he wants to do, building a business, making money. And so he said he often has to sit himself down and say, look, what is most important in your life? What are the priorities? What are things that are everlasting and eternal in your life? And so hearing those words he said, made me think about how even us as Christians need to do the same thing. We need to be conscious and think and say, what are the things interfering with my walk with God? And so here's my question for you and I this morning as I close. What is it that you could be allowing in your heart and in your life that continually prevents you from connecting with God? And so my challenge for you and I this week is that we commit to protecting the space in our hearts that is meant for God. And we make practical efforts to invite God's presence in our lives. We make a deliberate effort to connect with God in prayer, to read his word, to fellowship with other believers in community. All of these are ways that we can connect with God. But you and me know there are so many things fighting in competition to prevent us from connecting with our Father. And so may our hearts be a place where God feels at home. May our hearts truly be a temple where God's Spirit can reside. Let's pray together.